Innovation is the ability to see change as an opportunity and not a threat. Those were the words of Steve Jobs, the late CEO of Apple, whose technology completely revolutionized the way we interact with mobile devices. Now, 2020 has been nothing if not a year of unprecedented changes. We've all learned to adapt. We've learned to work from home, to socialize at a distance. For those of you with kids, you've probably learned to juggle work with homeschooling. And it's posed a threat to businesses as well. The arts and entertainment sector has suffered. Many small businesses and high street stores have had to close down. Perhaps it's been a real challenge for your business too. But as I say, necessity is the mother of invention. And the pandemic has provided an urgent need. We need new solutions to fix these new problems. But what do these solutions look like? Well, that's what I'd like to talk about today. My name is Antonia Forster, and I'm a Unity games and demos developer at Ultraleap. Today, I'd like to share with you some of the things I've worked on and some of the different touchless technology that's available to try and help move forward and innovate in this strange new world that we're all navigating now. So first, we'll be exploring some different examples of touchless technology, some that you definitely will have seen before and others that perhaps you haven't. Then I'd like to take a deep dive into hand tracking and look at how it works and how we can combine that with haptics for really powerful experiences. After that, I'd like to look at practical use cases. What different applications does this have, perhaps at home or in industry? And after that, I'd like to talk about some of the challenges or opportunities that I've personally worked through trying to design and implement a completely new kind of interface. So first of all, what do we mean by touchless technology? What does that actually look like? For the purpose of this talk, when I say touchless technology, I'm talking about something where you don't have to make contact with any device, any controller, or have any wearables. Now, of course, those things are valid and interesting solutions themselves. They solve different kinds of problems. For example, in the top left here, we can see the Valve Index controllers with this knuckles design. Now, they actually allow hand tracking because they can detect where your fingers are, but because they're an actual device that you have to hold, I wouldn't count them as touchless. Similarly, this is a wearable device developed by Cornell University that goes around your wrist. So you don't make contact with a screen with your fingertip, but again, something is actually touching your arm. And then finally, we're seeing solutions being rolled out by banks to try and prevent people from touching the buttons on ATMs out in public, which poses a hygiene concern during a pandemic. So one solution is having the ATM menu on your phone. It's a really valid and interesting solution. But again, you are touching a device, you're touching your phone. So for the purpose of this talk, I'm not going to include those as touchless technologies. So if those aren't touchless, then what is? Well, I would say there's four main types of touchless technologies that are coming into prominence or are ubiquitous already. The first is very simple, and you definitely will have interacted with it before. Simple presence detectors like motion-controlled lights or automatic doors or taps. One thing we're seeing a lot here in the UK is automatic hand sanitizer dispensers in stores. Very useful, but the main drawback there is that they're very binary, they're very simple, so they can only really detect whether you're there or not and be active or inactive. You can't really use that to control a complex interface or give a number of different inputs. So another possible solution is face tracking, facial recognition. Apple's flagship iPhone X does have Face ID. So it will scan the user's face and use that biometric data to unlock the phone for the correct user. That's really interesting, and we're also seeing that kind of technology in airports. But people have some security concerns about that being used in potentially places like shopping malls. Another example would be voice recognition. So perfect for use in the home, whether that's Google or Alexa or Siri. But again, it has potential issues used in public spaces, partly because of security concerns over recording audio, and also because it's difficult to use in a noisy environment where many people are talking at once. The final type of solution I'd like to look at in detail today is hand tracking. Now, of all of these different solutions, I think hand tracking has the most potential for use in terms of complex interfaces in public spaces, and I'd like to dive into why. Hand tracking has massive application in public spaces because touchscreens are already ubiquitous. We use them everywhere. And anywhere where we have a button or a touchscreen in a public place, we could replace it with a touchless, completely contactless screen. It also has massive application in virtual and augmented reality, VR and AR, which together I'm going to describe as XR, because you can actually just reach out and grab things in a very natural and very intuitive way. There are a number of companies that have recognized the massive application for hand tracking, particularly in XR. And I would say there's three big solutions providers in this space. The first is Facebook, who have the Oculus product, and their Quest headset is an untethered VR HMD head-mounted device, which has inbuilt hand tracking. Another possible solution is HTC's Vive Cosmos headset, which also has hand tracking, but isn't as widely used or recognized by developers. And then the final solutions provider is Ultraleap. Now, Ultraleap aren't a specific manufacturer of headsets. Instead, they provide the hand tracking stack and have just announced a deal with Qualcomm, which means they are probably going to be included in lots of head-mounted devices across the board in future. Ultraleap was created when Ultra Haptics, a company that makes haptic devices which allow you to feel objects in midair, merged with Leap Motion, who provide some of the world's most robust and best hand tracking. Full disclosure, I work for Ultraleap, so of all of the different tech stacks here, that's the one I'm most familiar and the one I'm able to provide the most detail about. If you've been following the news to do with Facebook and Oculus, and also if you've noticed that Apple have recently acquired a VR firm called Spaces, who specialize in VR video conferencing, you, like me, are probably convinced that spatial computing is the future of digital interaction. So I'm really excited about the use of hand tracking in this space. So how does hand tracking actually work? As I said, each of these different pipelines has different solutions, but I'm able to provide the most detail on the development pipeline for hand tracking with Ultraleap technology. So our hand tracking relies on this. This is the Leap Motion camera. It has two infrared sensors and an infrared light that flashes to illuminate your hand at 100 times every second. You can't see it because infrared is not detectable to the human eye, but the sensors can, and they capture that hand data. Now, its native software also has an inbuilt model of a hand, so it doesn't just detect where your surface is, but it can predict where the bones and the joints are, which means that if it can't see a finger because it's occluded, it can predict where that finger probably is based on the joints and position of your hand. This hand model and your movements are fed into the interaction engine, and that recognizes gestures like a pinch or a push, a swipe or a grab. And developers can easily use those in their games or applications in a number of different ways. Another thing you can do with this hand data is use it to create touchable experiences or touchable objects in midair that aren't really there, which is called haptics. Haptics actually means any sense of touch feedback. So the rumble in a gaming controller or vibration from your phone when you press a button would also count as haptic feedback. The type I'd like to look at in detail, which I use, is haptic created with ultrasound. To create the sensation of touch, you need one of these. This is a haptic array or speaker. It's actually an array of many transducers or miniature speakers that send out ultrasound. Ultrasound is too high-pitched for the human ear to detect, so you can't actually hear it, and every transducer on this array can be individually controlled. If you emit ultrasound from just one transducer and you put your hand over it, you won't feel anything because the signal isn't strong enough. But we can use algorithms to fire every individual transducer with very specific time delays so that all the waves meet in the same point in space and time. When that happens, we get constructive interference, so the strength of all the waves adds up. This is called the focal point, the point where all the waves meet. Using the hand tracking that I just mentioned, we can put the focal point at any position on your hand, and that creates a vibration that you can actually feel. By moving this focal point around moment to moment, we can create different sensations. So maybe lines or shapes, or even a hand scan, or a 3D object. So if I created a haptic sphere, if you put your hand into the top of it, you'd feel a small circle. As you submerge your hand deeper into it, you'd feel a wider circle. And as you reach the bottom, you'd feel a smaller circle again. If this was an in-person live demonstration, I'd love to invite someone up to feel an array and feel a haptic sensation and describe how it feels. But unfortunately, I can't do that as I'm delivering this remotely. However, if you were to ask me how it feels, I would describe it as a shape made of air, or putting your hand through a ghost or a hologram, because it doesn't provide any resistance, but you can discern the shape of something in quite some detail. Both hand tracking and haptics are incredibly cutting edge technologies, but what are the actual applications of this in our day-to-day lives or perhaps in industry? I'd like to look at 3 different applications across 3 different industry verticals and show you some of the projects that I've personally been working on. Now, in some of these use cases, we include haptics, so you can feel what you're interacting with. And in some of these use cases, we just have hand tracking. So I'll explain for each one whether we do or don't. The 3 industries I'd like to look at are digital out of home, which means any digital device that's out in a public space, automotive, the car industry, and mixed reality, so VR and AR. Digital out of home means any digital buttons or display or device you're interacting with in a public setting. It could be something as simple as the buttons on an elevator or an ATM, or it could be a digital screen or information kiosk in a hospital or an airport or a hotel check-in, or perhaps the self-checkout at a grocery store, or buying food in a fast food restaurant. Now, in each of these cases, the buttons and screens that you're interacting with are touched by thousands of people every day, which poses a big hygiene concern, particularly during a pandemic. And consumers are more aware of that than ever. A recent consumer survey found that when asked to describe the top 3 benefits and drawbacks of touchscreens, people describe hygiene as the #1 drawback. And only 11% of respondents said they thought that touchscreens were hygienic. The others responded with concerns as to lack of hygiene, and those concerns can lead to reluctance to interact, less purchasing, and also a stronger need for customer-facing staff to take orders and to help, higher cleaning regimens to aid consumer confidence, and potentially negative brand associations. The most hygienic interface of all is the one where you don't touch anything. But what would that actually look like in practice? Well, I personally developed a bakery demo to show what it might look like at a grocery store or bakery checkout. So I'll show you a short video of that now. As you can see in that demo, a touchless touchscreen works in exactly the same way as a regular touchscreen, except my finger remains about 30 centimeters away from the actual device surface. That completely eradicates any hygiene concerns and also instills confidence in the user. What I find most exciting is that we don't need very much specialist equipment at all. We don't need to go around replacing monitors or screens, because that video is actually my hand and my computer in the video. It's just a normal monitor. It's actually not even a touchscreen device, just a regular computer monitor. All we need is a Leap motion camera installed at the base facing upwards to capture the hand data. And then the actual touchless surface is purely virtual. So I find that incredibly exciting that these things can be converted with relatively low cost, and it has massive implications. We've made a number of different demos to show different applications in the digital out-of-home sector. So things like an elevator. I also developed an ATM, which is touchless, interactive movie posters. So we also have the potential to make things interactive that weren't before. So I think this is a really exciting application, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens in this industry in future. So we've looked at digital out of home. Next, I'd like to show you a little bit about how this can be used in automotive. The concerns of the automotive industry are very different. Safety is absolutely paramount. So the most important thing is that we make sure that our interfaces are intuitive to use and don't distract the driver so that they can keep their eyes on the road. I'll show you a quick video. This is just a section of a longer video to show you a demo that my team made for use in an actual car so that the driver can just use gestures. Instead of fiddling with small buttons on a dashboard, we have a gesture area above the gear stick. You can swipe and pinch and move. And there's also some statistics about how this benefited the driver. So here's that video now. Now, in that video, you can't see it, but the driver also gets haptic feedback. So the touchless screens we saw didn't have a haptic component, but this one did. There was a haptic array built into the car. And what that means is the user knows if the computer or the car recognize their gesture. So when they change the menu by opening their hand, or they pinch and raise the temperature in the car or the volume, they also have that haptic feedback to confirm that their gesture was recognized. And the stats you saw overlaid on the video were from an award-winning 2018 study by Nottingham University, which found that it reduced the distractibility of the driver. More than a third of drivers were able to complete the tasks of changing the heating and the volume, things like that, without taking their eyes away from the road at all. Those that did take their eyes away from the road did so for less time, and they had 3 times as much accuracy compared with doing the same tasks on a touchscreen. So all of this adds up to more attention focused on the road and safer drivers, which is another fantastic application of this technology, not just in a pandemic, but any time. The automotive industry is also thinking about the future. So driverless cars are increasingly becoming closer and closer to a reality. And when that happens, we'll be passengers and we won't have to pay attention to the road at all. What will we do with that time? That leads me nicely into my next industry, XR. As I mentioned at the start of the talk, mixed reality or spatial computing is becoming increasingly important, and hand tracking is such an integral part of that. When you're in virtual reality, by definition, you can't see the world around you. You can only see the virtual space. So if you're using controllers, you can't see them. You can only see their representation in the virtual world. And this can make it quite difficult to learn how to use controllers, particularly for someone who isn't a video gamer and therefore maybe has less exposure to things like controller input. That's really important when we think about the industry applications of this technology in particular. In contrast, when someone's put into VR, the first thing they do is reach out with their hands. It's very intuitive and it's universally accessible across cultures and backgrounds, regardless of someone else's previous exposure to controllers. So I think the use of your actual hands in VR not only is incredibly powerful and it's more accessible, but it also makes it feel more immersive when you're able to physically interact with your environment. It's a really incredible experience in virtual reality. In contrast to virtual reality, in augmented reality, you can see the world around you, but with things overlaid or augmented on top. So this can also happen on your phone. Technically, a Snapchat filter is augmented reality, but for the purpose of this talk, I'm really talking about head-mounted devices, or HMDs, with which you can do augmented reality. So these have transparent screens, and so you can see through and see the real world, and you can see your hands. So in AR, it's paramount that we have hand tracking because it feels very unnatural to see your hands and see the world around you, but not be able to interact with them. This is, as I said with VR, especially important when we think about industry application. Increasingly, we're seeing architects, designers, medical professionals, and people from all kinds of different industries using virtual reality and augmented reality for a number of different things, either to design or to visualize or also for training. Training, particularly in VR, is very common now. So particularly for things that are too expensive or dangerous to train someone on in real life. So perhaps training a construction worker operating heavy machinery, or a pilot about how to fly a plane or a helicopter, or perhaps a medical professional learning heart surgery. Now, as you can see from these images, to do that, we need extremely specialized controllers, which can be expensive and have to be custom made for the specific application, which isn't very practical. But if we have hand tracking, we can just mock up these controllers in VR, which is much cheaper. And there's a number of other benefits, because no controllers means, as I said, less cost, hygiene benefits, no need for batteries, less peripherals to keep track of. And it's not just that you can model real controllers, so maybe a scalpel for a surgeon or a cockpit for a pilot, but you can also create controls that aren't possible in real life. You could resize windows with your hand or swipe them like in Minority Report. So I'd like to show you a demo in which we do exactly that. This is a demo that is intended for the person sitting in a back seat of a driverless car. So in contrast to the automotive demo, which you saw a moment ago, this is not intended for a driver, but someone in a virtual reality headset sat inside a driverless car. But it doesn't have to be based on a driverless car. It's a shopping and social media experience. So you could imagine someone engaging in this in their home. You could use the same interfaces for gaming, or perhaps a shopping experience in a mall. So it has a really wide range of applications. Here's that video now. Now, that video also had haptic feedback for the user, so you could see they were using a shopping wheel, I guess, to look at different products and place them in the basket, and they would get haptic feedback to confirm that they'd done so. The end of that experience, which you saw briefly, is almost a meditative experience. You control these particles, they change color, and you also get haptic feedback when doing that. It's a really fantastic experience. If this was a live demo, I'd love to invite someone up to try it, but it's a real joy to see it being used in this way. So we've looked at some of the different applications of hand tracking, from use in training, in industry, to less distraction for drivers in automotive, to shopping experiences or different kinds of interfaces that could be used in gaming. Now I'd like to talk about some of the challenges or opportunities that I've faced trying to design a completely new kind of interface. For me personally, as a developer, the biggest challenge isn't in the technical implementation, because there's actually lots of documentation online, and getting access to the gestures and putting them into your application is not the hardest part of this. I think the difficult part is figuring out how to engage the user in something they probably have no experience of, because this is a very, very new emerging technology. So the first challenge, I think, is to find the most appropriate mode of interaction. Obviously, with a touchless touchscreen, there's only a couple of different modes of interaction. You could pinch the buttons or push them. But when it comes to virtual reality, there's a lot of different ways that the user could engage. So I'm going to look at just 3 of them. Then you have to decide on the most appropriate way to present your user interface or your UI. Again, on a screen, there's only really one option. You present it on the screen. But in virtual reality, there's many ways that you could position the interface for the user. And so that's a really important consideration. The next thing is, how do you capture and retain the user's attention? So in virtual reality or augmented reality, how do you control where the user is looking or moving? Because they have 6 degrees of freedom. They can move in 3 dimensions and look in another 3 as well. So how do you capture their attention? And for a touchless screen, how do you grab the attention of passers-by and let them know that this is interactive, and also not to actually contact the surface? And then finally, once you have and you've got their attention, how do you teach them how to actually use the technology, given that most people will not have experience of this before? How do you tell them that this is touchless and where to put their hand and perhaps which gestures to use? The first method of engagement that I'd like to talk about in virtual reality is direct manipulation. That means directly reaching out, grabbing objects, and interacting with them in the way that you might expect in the real world. The obvious benefit of this is it's very intuitive, and most users don't need any training in order to do this. But the downside of it is it works best on a larger scale, less so with things that are tiny. So typing on a VR keyboard, for example, is kind of tiring, because usually they're much bigger rather than being a regular size. You're usually poking buttons that are quite large and spaced apart, which can get tiring if you're inputting a very long string of letters. So there are upsides and downsides. It really depends on your application. Another option is using hand raise, and this is an example from Microsoft's mixed reality toolkit for AR and VR. You can see that you can use hand raise or beams from a controller or from your hand. And so traveling in VR is often done this way. You often use your hand or a controller to point to where you want to go and press it to prevent the user from moving around too much in real space. You can also use hand raise for typing, for example, to point at the button you want and then, for example, pinch or press a button on the controller to select the button, which is another interesting application. And the final input method I'd like to talk about is gesture recognition. Now, this is actually a clip from Google's gesture recognition and hand tracking pipeline, which I didn't mention as one of the big 3 providers at the beginning because it's very rarely used by developers. And this is actually done on a phone. The benefit of gestures is you can have a fairly wide range of different gestures that mean different things. But the problem with this is that the user has to remember which gesture does what. So it's usually used in combination. For example, I mentioned hand raise. If you're pointing somewhere and then you have a gesture like pinching, usually these modes of interaction work best when they're combined rather than relying on gestures alone. So those are the different modes of interaction. And once you've decided on which one you're going to use to actually navigate your UI, you have to decide, how are we going to represent this user interface to the user? So as I said, on a touchless screen, this is fairly intuitive. You just show it in screen space. But in virtual reality or augmented reality, you have a number of different options. The first is screen space, or in VR, this would be called a HUD or a head-up display. Now, I find that a bit jarring personally because it means that it follows the user. So it's a little bit like having a button or text on the inside of a helmet or against your eye. It can be useful for certain things. So it's a little bit like a Terminator overlay on the world or an Iron Man style helmet user interface. So I think in the right application, it can be appropriate, but largely I don't tend to use this very much in virtual reality. Your second option in terms of representing the UI to the user is doing it in avatar space, by which I mean attaching it to the hand, like in this image. Now, if you want the user to be able to use both hands, you can have the menu activate when the user flips the hand over. That's a very common method of activating the menu. Personally, I quite like this method. I think users find it fairly intuitive. They do usually have to be trained in how to do this, but once they do, it means the menu is always with them wherever they go in virtual space. So that can be quite a useful one too. Thirdly, you can put the menus in world space. In this image, you can see that being used in combination with avatar space. So the user is taking the menu out of their hand or avatar space and placing it in world space. Once they do, they can move around it, they can change where they look and walk, and it will remain in that stationary position in their virtual world. This is very useful, for example, if you're training a user on a piece of machinery or you're giving them a tour around a virtual building or factory, because you can use the interface like a menu attached to a specific place in the world, and the user can come up to it, interact with it, and walk away from it like a screen in the real world. Finally, you could put your user interface in object space. This is a little bit like world space, except it's anchored to a specific object. And this is quite useful if you want users to move objects around, but you want a label or an instruction to remain attached to that object. So this is an augmented reality example from the mixed reality toolkit. So each of these are options, and what I would say is there's no universal answer. Think about what problem you're trying to solve with your application and which type of user interface will be most intuitive and most appropriate for your use case for your specific audience. So now you've decided on your interaction and you've decided on how you're going to represent your UI. The next question is, how are you going to grab and retain your user's attention? In virtual reality, the user can move or look anywhere they want. So one common way of doing this in VR is to use audio cues, because if you hear a sound behind you, it's really hard to resist turning around to see what it is. We can also put dashed lines or arrows pointing to where we want the user to look. A little bit on the nose, but it can be appropriate and it usually works. Now, for a virtual screen, like a physical screen, like a touchless touch screen, how would you grab a passerby's attention, especially if they're not expecting that screen to be interactive? That's a really interesting challenge that we've been working on. So one way to do it is to have signage either next to the screen or text on the screen, but people don't tend to read signage, and that's across the board, not just in terms of movie posters, but regardless of the installation or the application. So another method that we've tried is putting footprints on the floor in front of the device to indicate that the user should stand there and interact with it. That works fairly well. And once a user is standing in front of a monitor and interacting with it, that attracts other users. And that seems to be extremely effective. It's called the honeypot effect. If you want to achieve that honeypot effect and get that first user interacting, you have to think very carefully about the placement of your installation in physical space, where it is in the mall or the physical setting that you've installed it. So now that you've got the user's attention, how do you train them in terms of how they actually interact with the application? In virtual reality, if you're using direct manipulation, it's very easy to train users in how to respond because they're physically moving objects around the space. But in something like a touchless screen or gesture recognition, perhaps in automotive, as we saw in our demo, it's much more challenging. How do you teach them gestures? Well, one way we've done it is by using animations of hands on the screen. And for automotive, this works very well because the user's attention is already on that screen. You're not trying to grab the attention of a passerby. We use animations of hands and the user copies it to do simple gestures like pinching, rising, lowering, and perhaps opening and closing the hand. One of the keys for gestures is not to teach too many and also to keep it fairly simple. Once the user's been taught, they can continue to use it throughout the demo. So a naive user is the most challenging one to teach. Once they have it, you can continue to use that throughout. Again, I'll give the caveat that There's no universal answer for this. The most important thing is that you test out different modes of interaction, different types of UI, different gestures and ways of grabbing attention and teaching the user, and you actually conduct user testing. So please don't take any of what I'm saying as finalized gospel. We're constantly learning and experimenting because this is a completely emerging space. There's a lot left to learn, and I think that's incredibly exciting. So conduct user testing and think very carefully about what's most appropriate for your individual application. Which nearly brings me to the end of my talk. We've looked at what touchless technology solutions really are. We've taken a deep dive into how hand tracking works and how that can be combined with haptics for really powerful effects. We've looked at applications in industry, from digital out of home to automotive to the very bleeding edge of mixed reality. I've shared some of the challenges and opportunities of working in such an emerging space and designing these completely new kinds of interactions and interfaces. But if you take one thing away from this talk, I want it to be the quote that I shared at the beginning. Innovation is the ability to see change as an opportunity and not a threat. In these ever-changing times, we need innovation more than ever. To solve problems we've never seen before, we need solutions that we've never imagined. This is the beginning of a new age of technology, and I'm really excited to see what innovations come next. Thank you so much. I have time for a 15-minute Q&A now, so thanks a lot. Thank you.